you hold out your arm. You point one finger toward the far corner of the room. You don't say a word, don't make a sound. Your dog's head snaps around, follows the exact line of your finger, and takes off running in that direction, tail already going. You barely register it happening. It's background noise in your day, a dozen times over, as automatic as breathing. Now try the same thing with a chimpanzee, your closest living relative on the planet, sharing well over 98% of your DNA. Most of the time, it just won't work. The chimp will stare at your finger, not where you're pointing. The finger itself, like it's the object you're offering, not a signal about something else entirely. It has no idea what you're trying to tell it. That's where this gets strange. The species with the brain closest to yours reads you worse than an animal that's only been living alongside you for a few tens of thousands of years. If raw intelligence decided this contest, chimpanzees should win, easily. They use tools in the wild. They deceive rivals inside their own social hierarchies. They solve spatial puzzles that stump most other animals on Earth, including some primates smarter on paper than your average house pet. But put a single pointed finger in front of a chimp, something a 1-year-old human baby can already read correctly, and it freezes. Picture yourself as that dog for a second. You don't see a finger as an object sitting in space. You see it as an arrow, a directional signal, an unspoken question your brain answers almost instantly. What does this person want me to know? No language, no formal training session, just an instinct for reading intention that was already wired into you before you were even born, sitting there, waiting to be used. This isn't really a story about dogs being smarter than chimpanzees, because in most other ways, they aren't. It's a story about a social compass, something pre-installed in a dog's brain that always points back toward humans, while a chimpanzee's brain, more powerful in almost every other measurable way, never got that same compass built in at all. The root of this doesn't sit in some modern research lab under fluorescent lights. It sits somewhere between 15 and 30,000 years ago, around the campfires of hunter-gatherers, long before agriculture, long before anything resembling a city. Gray wolves started lingering at the edges of human camps to scavenge scraps of bone and fat. The boldest wolves, but crucially not the most aggressive ones, tolerated human presence just enough to feed safely, and they survived better near people, raising more pups to adulthood. Nobody back then set out to build an animal that could read a pointing finger. People simply stopped killing the calm ones and kept killing or driving off the aggressive ones, and without meaning to, they kicked off a selection process that would run uninterrupted for thousands of generations. So, here's the question this whole video is built around. How does a selection pressure this small, just favoring the animal that's a little less aggressive around campfires, end up producing a piece of social wiring so sophisticated it outperforms the smartest primate on the planet at reading you? A lot of people assume dogs understand pointing simply because they're trained to, or because they've lived close to humans long enough to pick it up the way you'd slowly learn to read a stranger's facial expressions. That assumption turns out to be wrong. In 2002, primatologist Brian Hare, working at Harvard and later at Duke University, published a study in the journal Science showing that puppies only 9 weeks old with zero formal training already read human pointing gestures better than adult chimpanzees and even better than adult wolves raised by hand from birth. This isn't a skill dogs slowly pick up over a lifetime living with you. It's closer to something already written into the genome long before a puppy ever meets its first human. Here's a case that makes this concrete. At a site called Bonn Oberkassel in western Germany, archaeologists uncovered a grave from roughly 14,000 years ago containing a young dog buried. Alongside 2 humans, its teeth showing signs of severe illness that would have kept it alive for weeks only with human care and feeding. That single grave tells you the bond wasn't casual or recent even then. By the time that dog died, people were already investing real effort keeping a sick animal alive purely for the relationship, not for hunting, not for guarding, just for the animal itself. Whatever social wiring let that dog read its caretakers well enough to be worth that effort had already been running for thousands of years by that point. Here's the first detail worth sitting with because it rules out the easy explanation. Wolves, the direct ancestors of every dog alive today, don't naturally have this skill either, even the ones raised in the most human-saturated environment imaginable. Researcher Monique Udell and her colleagues raised wolf pups from the moment their eyes opened, bottle-fed them around the clock, let them sleep in the same beds as people, treated them in every practical sense exactly like puppies. Those hand-raised wolves still read pointing gestures noticeably worse than ordinary pet dogs, despite getting earlier and far closer contact with humans than most family dogs ever receive in their whole lives. If growing up around people were enough on its own, hand-raised wolves should perform on par with dogs. They don't, not even close. That gap tells you the real difference isn't upbringing. It's something baked into the genetic blueprint that domestication quietly rewired over thousands of years. This is the piece that actually explains why. In 1959, Russian geneticist Dmitry Belyaev began a now-famous experiment in Novosibirsk, Siberia, breeding wild silver foxes based on exactly one trait, and only one: how calm and friendly they were around humans. Nothing about coat color, nothing about size or shape, just tameness, tested and scored generation after generation. In under 30 generations, roughly 35 years, those foxes started showing floppy ears, curled tails, patches of white fur, and smaller skulls, physical traits nobody had ever selected for on purpose. Scientists call this domestication syndrome, a cluster of physical and behavioral changes that shows up as an unplanned side effect when you select an animal purely for one trait, tameness, and nothing else. And critically, those same tame foxes also started reading human pointing gestures far better than their wild, unselected relatives, without a single training session, purely as a byproduct of being bred for friendliness. Here's where you need to slow down for a moment, because this next part sits right at the edge of what scientists actually know for certain, rather than what they suspect. Researchers still don't fully agree on the exact biological mechanism behind domestication syndrome, meaning why selecting for calmness alone drags along a whole cluster of seemingly unrelated physical and cognitive changes at the same time. One influential idea, proposed by evolutionary biologist Adam Wilkins and colleagues in 2014, points to a group of embryonic cells called neural crest cells, cells that happen to influence the adrenal glands, ear cartilage, pigment cells, and several brain regions all at once during early development. That's still a working hypothesis, actively debated, not settled fact, but it's the best current explanation available for how selecting one personality trait could accidentally drag a whole new social skill set along for the ride. Behavioral researcher Adam Miklosi at Eötvös Loránd University in Budapest, who has led the long-running family dog project for more than 2 decades, describes what's happening here as dogs developing a form of joint attention with humans, meaning the ability to look where someone else is looking and understand without being told that you're both focused on the exact same thing. Human infants start reliably showing this exact skill somewhere between 9 and 14 months old, and researchers consider it a foundation stone underneath all human language and social bonding that follows afterward. Dogs, a species with no language of their own and no capacity to develop one, appear to have independently evolved a stripped-down version of that same foundational human skill, purely because it helped them survive alongside you. Now go back to the image from the start, you as the dog, staring at that pointed finger for the first time. What you're actually doing there is more complicated than it looks from the outside. Your brain has to ignore the hand itself, the nearest physical object right in front of you, and jump straight to something far more abstract sitting behind it, the intention driving the gesture. That's a cognitive leap that even chimpanzees, with bigger brains and far more sophisticated tool use, routinely fail to make because out in the wild, a chimpanzee never once had to read another species' intentions to survive. Dogs needed to, every single day, for 15,000 years straight, with no exceptions. So the real cost here isn't a trade of general intelligence. Dogs didn't give up problem-solving ability just to gain people-reading skills instead. It's a narrower, sharper trade-off than that. Dogs evolved into specialists in one extremely narrow domain, decoding human social signals in real time, and in exchange they became almost entirely dependent on humans to survive at all, in almost every other domain of life. A pet dog lost in true wilderness without its owner will struggle to survive far more than a wolf ever would in the exact same forest, and studies on feral dog populations back this up, showing that dogs without ongoing human contact rarely re-establish the kind of stable, self-sufficient pack structure wolves rely on. The variability that makes a dog so good at understanding you comes bundled, permanently, with an inability to make it on its own without you nearby. It's not a flaw in the design, it's the design. Evolution didn't build a more independent animal that happens to also read your gestures. It built a specialist so tightly tuned to reading humans that independence from humans was never really on the table again. Which brings you back, finally, to that opening image. Your arm extends. Your finger points toward the corner of the room, and your dog is already moving before you've even finished the gesture, before your arm has fully straightened. That small motion, the one that feels like absolutely nothing, is actually the finish line of an evolutionary journey tens of thousands of years long, starting with the boldest wolves who dared to creep close to your ancestors' fires, running through countless generations of selection nobody ever planned or wrote down, and landing, finally, right here, as a skill your closest living primate relatives never managed to develop at all. So next time you point for your dog, and it just gets it, instantly, without hesitation, ask yourself something. Are you actually teaching it anything in that moment? Or are you simply switching on something that's been sitting there, written into it for 15,000 years, just waiting for you to raise your hand?